Folktales, defined by Google, is a story originating in popular culture, typically passed on by word of mouth. Now, this definition is fine and all, but I find that it really disrespects what these tales truly represent to people and how they function in society. You probably remember Horton Hears a Who or The Ugly Duckling as stories from your childhood, and in line with this definition, they would be folktales. Now, this is not to say that they aren't good stories. You might personally love them, but I don't believe that they would ever truly count as a folktale, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand why folktales fascinate me. Now, to get things clear, I've never enjoyed literature classes, and it's a rare occurrence where I'd research stories beyond what was necessary for schooling. But one of those rarities is folktales. When I was first presented with the teacher's decision to make me do a comprehensive study of a folktale of my choosing, I was certainly annoyed. What I never expected was just how unique and interesting the phenomenon of folktales are. But in order to answer why I think folktales are so interesting, first we need to understand something else: myths. Humans by nature have a desire to understand the world around them. There are likely many reasons that cause this, but I want to focus on what I believe to be one of the more important aspects. That being, when a person thinks they understand something, they feel a lot more secure. This has led to a number of things created to understand the world around you, which is commonly referred to as a mythos. Little pixies that misplace your things, dragons which watch from the depths of the wild, the gods that keep the world in order, an entire host of entities in the world that are the direct cause of many things humans feel themselves incapable of controlling. After all, the world is full of strange and terrifying things: droughts, volcanoes, the boundless depths of the ocean, intoxication. Humans create personifications for the entity that must be in control of these natural acts, and tend to name these personifications gods. This, in short, is why people create pantheons, the why of why create these myths. As to humans, the best evidence that some entity is aware of how the world should function is the mere fact that it's still functioning so well. If you left a bike unattended for long enough, it would stop working, so why would the world be any different? Of the many things that people have named, I want to focus on the personification of death. Death is the least controllable variable in many people's lives. It's also the most universal experience ever. To break it down, all death truly comes down to is when something dynamic stops being dynamic. So humanity created a personality, gave it a visage. People tell themselves, death is a person that comes to reap us, specifically when it is our time to die. No sooner, no later. Personification is important to humans because it allows the belief that there's a reason behind the things that aren't very well understood. Much like when you're a child and an adult does something you don't fully understand, you can at least be assured by the fact that the person acting understands the reasons. Now, whether or not your gods are real remain to be seen. But these myths that are created around said personifications are important to people as they give an insight into how the world works. As mentioned earlier, it's comforting to have some understanding that the universe is not cruel and uncaring, but rather cared for by these gods. Myths give answers as to where things come from and how they got that way. For example, in Roman mythos, the question, where do spiders come from and why do they spin silk, is answered by the story of Arachne, where she challenged Athena to a weaving contest, and upon Arachne winning the contest, Athena, beset by a moment of rage from being outdone, turns Arachne into a spider. This is where folk tales make themselves distinct from myths, as folk tales instead focus on people. In the same way humans have questions about why the world around them is the way it is, people have questions pertaining to why humans are the way they are. Why do we age? What makes humans so greedy? Why do we speak different languages? Questions most humans will have asked at some point in their life. Folktales try to answer these questions, and much like myths, are both an important aspect of folklore, although they shouldn't be confused. No question about the world or human nature would have ever had a chance of being truly answered in ages past. So humans do as they always do when they need answers. They create stories. And whether you're aware or not, that's what folktales are for. They help people understand society and humanity in the same way people can understand the world around them through myths. To really exemplify what I mean, I'm going to retell a story that I myself once heard, with a bit of paraphrasing. I don't recall the name of the story, nor do I know the author. Much like any other folktale, it's a story passed down and remembered. Once upon a time, the king of giants was nearing his demise. When death inevitably appeared, the king refused to allow death to have his way, and in an attempt to force the king to accept his fate, death and the king of giants began to fight. Eventually, death was defeated. A short time after Death was beaten and battered, he prepared to enter that door he was only ever meant to bring others to. However, fate had other plans. As a young man who was out on a walk happened to find Death. Now, had this been anyone else, the young man would have helped Death out of the kindness of his heart. But at this moment, the young man saw an opportunity, and in exchange for helping Death, he desired to become immortal. This request, going against the very tenets that Death stood for, of course led to the request being denied, insisting that when the man was meant to die, he would die. The young man eventually understood. Instead, he asked Death for a warning, a heads up, if you will, for when Death was going to come on by. Many years passed, and the man had not heard from Death. Upon the eve of a new year, the man, no longer young, laid in his bed, when suddenly he felt a presence. Death had come for him. And in a moment of emotion, the man claims that Death gave him no warning of his demise, that Death came far too unexpectedly. In response, Death stares the man in the eye, seemingly aghast. I gave you no warning. Then what do you make of the graying of your hair or the weakening of your bones? The young man stared back with confusion. Was the fact that your appetite decreased and your mind slowing down not a sign of my approach? If you believe that I gave you no forewarning, you are a fool. The man, having realized that the previous years had been his warning, resigned himself to death and let go. And then they lived happily ever after. No, of course, that's not the ending. But it is the ending you might have expected from a folktale. Which is interesting because there's no convention that a story needs to end in a happy way, and in a lot of cases of the original tellings of these stories, the endings aren't happy, or the characters will be better relative to the suffering they just endured, which would ultimately be about the same as before. But this does make sense as to the teaching element of these stories, as doing something negative will lead to negative outcomes. In the story, you might gloss over the fact that Death is dying, thinking of it as just a plot mechanic to get the young man to be involved. But I think it's pretty important to note, because the story is telling us that, to quote a certain tome, with strange aeons, even death may die. Now, whether it's intentional or not, it really helps enforce the idea that death is an unavoidable outcome in the mind of whoever listens. Sure, but the giant was able to fight off death this time. But the story is also telling us that aging is a process created to make us more similar to a corpse in life, so that when death finally appears, everyone will be ready. Almost every single human will at some point in their life ask the question, why do we age? And the story tells us the answer. It's so we can die. This is incredibly fascinating because if you look at that answer from the perspective of someone from the Middle Ages or as some small barbarian village in the woods, well, it would be incredibly true. Back in the age where physical labor was vital for the survival of the group, growing older meant you needed to be replaced by the young since you wouldn't be able to keep working. And by the time someone would have died of old age, all their responsibilities would have been redistributed to a younger generation where the only effective difference between you being alive and you being dead would be the amount of food that you need. Now, that is, of course, disregarding the sentimental aspect of humanity. But of course, not all folk tales are so obvious in their meanings, such as older tellings of Little Red Riding Hood potentially being about a cycle of rebirth, represented by Little Red being eaten and subsequently freed from the stomach of the wolf, which would answer a question of what happens when we die, by telling you that you get reborn, a different person and yet the same. Although a more consistent question posed by the story would be, is it smart to be blindly trusting? With a clear answer of no. And in regards to the lumberjack, I mean, it's either trusting that person or dying to a wolf. It's not quite the same thing as being blindly trusting. That leads to another aspect of folktales as answers to questions about common etiquette in society, teaching children the do's and don'ts of their cultures. The story Goldilocks has a far more harmless question relative to the others, being what happens if we take advantage of someone else's resources? With the answer being you get chased out and no real consequences. But that doesn't seem right. And it shouldn't, because the story of Goldilocks has evolved so drastically over the years that the original telling of the story potentially involved Goldilocks being a fox, which had been translated to the phrase vixen, interpreted not as the literal animal, but as slang for an attractive adult woman, and now into its current form. The lesson was originally a lot more brutal, with Goldilocks being crucified onto a church. But of course, that is another aspect of what makes folktales so unique, in that they are constantly evolving to match the time they exist in. In the past, when the average life expectancy of a person was only around 30 years of age, these stories taught you that making mistakes will lead to your death, and so they helped children learn what to avoid. Nowadays, being inside of someone else's house by accident as a child won't really lead to you dying, but it might lead to other consequences. And possibly that's one of the reasons why folktales are still so prominent in today's societies. Now, none of this is to say that other stories don't have a similar depth to them, or that folktales have to be defined like this. It's just that I find folktales are never brought up when it comes to trying to dissect a culture. It's so often people talk about myths or pantheons when speaking of cultures. And don't get me wrong, all of that is incredibly fascinating as well. It's just folktales have just as much, if not more so, to do with these cultures when considering the same factors of relative perspectives, demographics, and climates. Ultimately, folktales are just another aspect of human cultures. It's not as if anything I've said is groundbreaking information. Folktales are just stories that exist without authors, and yet is known to everyone. I don't need to tell you the story of Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks, because if you're of Western descent, you would already know these stories incredibly well. Really, folktales just fascinate me.